The silence hung heavy like morning mist in the polished hallways of St. Vincent's retirement home, where time seemed suspended between the metallic click of canes and the muffled shuffle of felt slippers. It was one of those places where the hours stretched like spilled honey, where each day mirrored the last in a routine as predictable as sunrise. In room 12, near the window overlooking the garden of blue hydrangeas, Anthony Miller adjusted his thick glasses on his aquiline nose, watching the dewdrops slowly slide down the still sleeping petals through the misted glass. At 82, Tony, as the nurses affectionately called him, carried on his face a geography of deep wrinkles that seemed to map decades of untold stories. His hands, marked by prominent veins and the dark splotches of age, trembled slightly as he held the lukewarm cup of coffee that Anna, the nurse on duty, brought him every morning at 7 sharp. There was something in Tony's faded blue eyes that intrigued those who knew him, a contained intensity, like embers still warm under ancient ashes, suggesting that behind that apparent fragility resided a strength that time had not completely erased. Mornings at the home followed an unchanging ritual. After breakfast in the common dining room, oatmeal, bread with margarine, and a slice of papaya, the residents scattered to the common areas. Some settled in the television room, where the high volume compensated for progressive hearing loss. Others preferred the sunny veranda, weaving repetitive conversations about medications, delayed visits, and daytime talk shows. Tony, however, always chose the quiet library, a small room with dusty shelves and a few wooden tables where few ventured to read. There he spent his hours leafing through old newspapers with the meticulousness of someone searching for something specific, though he himself wasn't quite sure what. Sometimes he'd pause at a news story about politics or military affairs, furrowing his brow as if trying to decipher a personal enigma. Other times, his hands would tremble imperceptibly as he turned a page, and for a fleeting moment his eyes would gleam with a different light. Not the resigned melancholy of the days, but something more ardent, more alive. The doctors began to express concern. Dr. Henry, the geriatrician responsible for Tony's care, noticed changes in his behavior. Insomnia, agitation, constant murmuring of names and dates that made no sense to the staff. "It could be the beginning of a dementia process," he commented to the head nurse. "The stress of this incident with the drone may have accelerated something that was already latent." But Tony knew he wasn't losing his mind. On the contrary, he felt that he was finally recovering something essential that he had lost over years of voluntary forgetfulness. He needed to access the contents of the flash drive before anyone decided to confiscate it or subject it to security protocols. The nursing home's library had an old computer, mainly used by the staff for administrative tasks, but it could serve his purpose. Anna, the nurse who had witnessed the encounter with the drone, began to observe him with growing interest. There was something about Tony's transformation that aroused her professional and human curiosity. During her night shifts, she saw him walking the halls, not with the typical confusion of disoriented elderly people, but with a silent determination that suggested purpose. She decided to follow his movements more closely, not with suspicion, but with an intuition that something important was happening. It is at this point in our story that I need to pause to share something with those of you following this narrative. If you are feeling the same excitement as I am in telling Tony's story, if you are curious to find out how this extraordinary journey will unfold, I ask that you consider subscribing to the channel and activating the bell. Stories like this, which celebrate the dignity and courage of those who are often forgotten by society, deserve to be shared and remembered. Every subscription and every notification activated helps to bring these messages of hope and resilience to more people who need to hear them. Now, let's return to Mr. Miller and discover how his last mission will transform not only his life, but potentially the lives of many other people. On the morning of a Friday, as the nursing home plunged into the deepest silence and only the emergency lights remained in the hallways, Tony got out of bed with an agility he hadn't shown in years. He put on his robe and slippers, and with measured steps, silent from a never-forgotten military instinct, he went to the library. The door was unlocked, as always, as no one imagined that the elderly had any interest in nighttime adventures. The computer was an obsolete machine, but functional. Tony turned on the monitor, and the bluish light illuminated his concentrated face. His hands, surprisingly steady, inserted the flash drive into the USB port. For a moment that seemed eternal, the device remained silent. Then, slowly, a folder opened on the screen. Operation Phoenix Classified Files. What Tony saw in the next 2 hours made him cry, not tears of sadness, but of a deep and painful relief. There were the documents he had sworn he had seen destroyed, the photographs he thought had been lost forever, the testimonies of comrades he believed had died taking their secrets with them. There were grainy videos, audio recordings distorted by time, but everything was authentic, everything was true. A specific file caught his attention. Final Report, Lieutenant Mark Olson. Mark had been his direct subordinate, a young, idealistic officer who had uncovered the first evidence of corruption. In the report, dated 3 days before the fatal ambush, Mark detailed how the mission had been compromised from the start, how confidential information had been leaked to the targets of the investigation, resulting in a massacre that was officially filed as an operational incident. Tony read the report 3 times, each word reopening wounds he thought he'd healed. Mark had uncovered not only the initial corruption, but a much wider network involving arms trafficking, money laundering, and contract killings. There were names of generals who would later become national heroes, respected businessmen, influential politicians. And there was proof, signed documents, compromising photographs, recordings that left no room for doubt. As he transferred the files to the cloud, using an email account Anna had created weeks earlier to help him communicate with a distant niece, Tony felt a tightness in his chest. It wasn't just the excitement of finally having access to the truth he'd sought for decades. It was the certainty that, by revealing it, he might be signing his own death warrant. Powerful men had killed to keep these secrets. They wouldn't hesitate to eliminate a frail old man in a forgotten nursing home. Anna appeared at the library door at 5 in the morning during her routine rounds. She found Tony still in front of the computer with the expression of someone who had seen ghosts or perhaps had finally set them free. She approached silently, and when she saw the screen full of military documents and old photographs, she instinctively understood that she was witnessing something historic. "Mr. Miller," she whispered, "what is all this?" He turned to her, and Anna saw in his faded blue eyes an intensity that reminded her of the World War II documentaries she'd watched in college. The look of men who had seen terrible things and carried secrets too heavy for one person to bear. "It's the truth, Anna, the truth they tried to bury with me." Anna made a decision that would change her life. Instead of calling Mrs. Davis or following the nursing home protocols, she chose to stay. She helped Tony organize the files, create backups, and draft an explanatory document that contextualized the evidence. During the following hours, as the nursing home slowly awoke around them, they worked like unlikely conspirators. An 80-year-old war veteran and a 35-year-old nurse, united by the certainty that some truths are too important to remain buried. The drone returned Sunday morning, landing this time on the library porch. It brought precise instructions. The files should be shared immediately with a list of investigative journalists, academics, and human rights organizations. Time was running out. There were rumors that the operation had been discovered, and powerful forces were already mobilizing to contain the leak. Mrs. Davis, alerted by the unusual commotion in the library, arrived accompanied by 2 nursing home security guards. She found Tony and Anna hunched over the computer, sending emails to dozens of recipients. The director's expression oscillated between maternal concern and administrative irritation. "Mr. Miller, this has gone too far. I'm going to have to confiscate this equipment and call your family. You can't disrupt the peace of the nursing home with these fantasies." That's when Tony did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He rose from his chair with a dignity that seemed to emanate from decades of military command, looked directly at Mrs. Davis, and spoke in a voice he hadn't used in years. Firm, clear, full of natural authority. "Mrs. Davis, with all due respect, you can manage this nursing home as you see fit. You can decide when we have dinner, what programs we watch on television, what medications we take, and when we go to sleep. But you can't decide when a man should abandon his last mission." The silence that followed was charged with tension. The security guards looked uncertainly at the director, waiting for instructions. Anna remained beside Tony, a silent but eloquent loyalty. Other residents had approached, drawn by the commotion, and watched the scene with a curiosity they hadn't shown for anything in a long time. Mrs. Davis opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a sound coming from outside. Distant sirens, but approaching. Cars stopping in front of the nursing home. Upset voices at the reception. The leak had reached the press, and the outside world was knocking at the doors of St. Vincent's retirement home. In a matter of minutes, reporters began to arrive. Not just local journalists, but correspondents from national outlets who had received the files and immediately understood their historical significance. The evidence was irrefutable. Decades of crimes, corruption, and impunity were being exposed through the trembling hands of an old man the world had forgotten. Tony received the journalists in the nursing home's common room, seated in a worn leather armchair, wearing his most dignified outfit, a navy blue suit he had worn to nephews' weddings and friends' funerals. His hands no longer trembled. His voice came out clear and precise as he recounted events from 70 years ago as if they had happened the previous day. He told them about Mark Olson, the young lieutenant who died defending the truth. He detailed the ambush that decimated his unit while the real criminals remained protected by their political connections. He explained how he had spent decades trying to forget, medicating the survivor's guilt with alcohol first, then with obsessive work, finally with voluntary isolation. "You want to know why I agreed to live in this nursing home?" he asked a reporter who had questioned his motivations. "Because I thought it was time to let the dead rest in peace. But I discovered that the dead don't rest while the truth isn't told. They visited me every night, whispering names, showing faces, asking for justice." The interviews lasted 3 days. Military history experts were called in to verify the authenticity of the documents. Everything was confirmed: dates, places, names, events. Operation Phoenix had indeed happened, and its failure wasn't due to incompetence or bad luck, but to the deliberate betrayal of men who swore to defend the country. The impact was immediate and devastating for many reputations built on lies. Families of officers killed decades ago finally got answers about the fate of their loved ones. Human rights organizations demanded formal investigations. Congress established a parliamentary inquiry commission. Anna remained beside Tony throughout the process, no longer as his nurse, but as his volunteer personal assistant. She had resigned from the nursing home, not due to pressure from the administration, which actually tried to dissuade her from getting involved, but because she felt she had found her true purpose. She helped Tony organize his memories, prepare additional testimonies, and respond to the hundreds of letters arriving from across the country. Many of these letters came from war veterans, children of military personnel killed under suspicious circumstances, widows who had spent decades without answers. All expressed gratitude for his courage in speaking out, for giving a voice to the dead, for proving that the truth, however buried, always finds a way to emerge. 6 months after the first encounter with the drone, Tony was sitting on the same veranda of room 12, but the man was completely different. He had gained weight, his back was straighter, his eyes shone with a vibration that had disappeared for decades. He was still an 82-year-old man living in a nursing home, but he was also nationally recognized as a silent hero, a keeper of memory, a symbol that it's never too late to do the right thing. Anna continued working with him, now officially employed by the foundation that had been formed to organize and preserve the Operation Phoenix files. They had become an unlikely but effective team. Him providing historical context and fact-checking, her organizing everything in contemporary and accessible language. The drone never returned. No one discovered who had orchestrated that mysterious operation, who had collected and preserved the evidence for so long, who had decided that Anthony Miller was the right person to validate everything. There were theories. Former unit comrades who had thrived in civilian careers, children of deceased officers who had dedicated their lives to seeking the truth, investigative journalists who had spent decades collecting pieces of the puzzle. But Tony didn't worry about these questions. For him, the important thing was that the mission had been accomplished. Mark Olson and the other fallen comrades had finally found their voices. The truth had been freed from its decades-long captivity. Justice, however belated, was being served. During sunny afternoons, when he sat on the veranda watching the hydrangea garden, which was now cared for with much more attention since St. Vincent's retirement home had become famous and received regular visits from journalists and historians, Tony reflected on the mysterious paths life sometimes takes. He had spent 40 years trying to forget his military career, burying painful memories, convincing himself that the past should remain in the past. Ironically, it was only when he fully accepted his condition as a forgotten elderly man, when he resigned himself to anonymity and irrelevance, that fate offered him the opportunity to accomplish his most important work. The other residents of the nursing home treated him with an awestruck respect that sometimes bothered him. He remained the same old Tony. He enjoyed his oatmeal for breakfast, watched daytime talk shows on television, took his medications on time. But there was a fundamental difference. Now he knew that his life had had a greater purpose, that his existence had contributed to something more significant than his own survival. One winter afternoon, while watching the first flowers of the season bloom in the garden, Tony received an unexpected visitor, a well-dressed middle-aged man who introduced himself as Mark Olson's grandson. He held in his hand an old photograph. Mark in military uniform, smiling at the camera with the naive confidence of someone who still believed that the world was a just place. "My grandfather died when my father was only 5 years old," the visitor explained. "Our family never knew exactly what had happened to him. We only knew that he had died in a classified military operation. For decades, my father tried to uncover the truth, but always ran into classified documents and evasive answers." He paused, looking directly at Tony with eyes reminiscent of Mark's. "Because of you, we finally know that our grandfather died a hero, defending truth and justice. That means more to our family than you can imagine." Tony held the photograph with hands that trembled now, not from weakness, but from emotion. He vividly remembered the young lieutenant, his determination, his integrity, his courage in confronting much more powerful men when he discovered the evidence of corruption. Mark had paid the ultimate price for his honesty, but his death had not been in vain. "Your grandfather was a good man," Tony said, returning the photograph. "He knew he could die because of what he had discovered, but he chose to continue, because he believed that some truths are more important than our individual lives. Now you know he was right." When the visitor left, Tony remained on the veranda until the sun completely set. Anna came to check on him and found him contemplating the starry sky with an expression of profound peace she had rarely seen in anyone. "Are you all right, Mr. Miller?" "I'm all right, Anna. For the first time in decades, I'm all right." That night, Tony slept the most peaceful sleep of his adult life. He wasn't visited by nightmares of ambushes or haunted by the voices of fallen comrades. Instead, he dreamt of Mark Olson and the others. But this time, they weren't asking for justice. They were thanking him. They were finally at peace. The legacy of Operation Phoenix spread far beyond historical archives and newspaper headlines. It inspired a new generation of investigative journalists, encouraged other veterans to break their silence about war crimes, and demonstrated that even the most buried truths can emerge when someone has the courage to unearth them. More importantly, Tony's story became a symbol that it's never too late to make a difference. In schools, universities, and community centers across the country, his narrative was told as an example of quiet resistance, of dignity preserved against all odds, of how an ordinary man can become extraordinary when he chooses to put truth above personal safety. Anna eventually wrote a book about the entire experience, titled Cobra's Last Flight. It wasn't a commercial bestseller, but it became required reading in journalism, military history, and professional ethics courses. Every copy sold contributed to the foundation that preserved the Operation Phoenix archives and supported the families of military personnel killed under suspicious circumstances. Years passed. Tony continued living at St. Vincent's retirement home, now recognized not as just another senior, but a living testament to national history. He received regular visits from students, researchers, and journalists. Each conversation was an opportunity to teach that courage has no age, that truth has no expiration date, and that justice, even delayed, is still justice. One autumn morning, as the leaves began to turn yellow in the garden and the air carried that particular nostalgia of the season, Anna found Tony still asleep in his bed. He had passed away peacefully during the night, a subtle smile on his lips. On his nightstand, he left a letter addressed to her. My dearest Anna, if you're reading this, it means I've finally reunited with my comrades. Don't grieve. I lived longer than I deserved, and more importantly, I lived to see the truth prevail. You were the angel God sent to help me fulfill my last mission. Keep telling our stories. Keep reminding the world that heroes don't always wear uniforms or medals. Sometimes they're just ordinary people who choose to do the right thing.